Hi, everyone. Welcome to Divorce Coalition Live, a radio show dedicated to change in the domestic abuse world. I'm your host, Beverly Price, CEO and Executive Director of the Divorce Coalition and certified divorce coach at Her Empowered Divorce. The Divorce Coalition is a nonprofit organization dedicated to increasing education and awareness among divorce professionals and create process change for a more supportive and less traumatic divorce experience for abuse survivors. We have united top podcast guests and divorce professionals to create systematic change in the divorce process for abuse victims. With expert guests, practical advice, and enlightening conversations, you'll find that knowledge is power in creating change in this world of domestic abuse. So, without further ado, let's get started. Today, I am so thrilled to have my guest, Theresa Viera, attorney at Modern Legal in Charlotte, North Carolina. Theresa is a fabulous attorney with much experience in the world of domestic abuse. She's practiced only family law for over 11 years. And this is critical because she is just a specialist and full of knowledge about family law. She founded Modern Legal in 2020 to address the growing need of different approaches and adequately address the legal needs of her community. Enduring domestic violence is hard, but escaping domestic violence can prove even harder at times. I want to make clear that domestic violence, that we use domestic violence and domestic abuse interchangeably, but domestic abuse is so much more than physical violence. So learn more about the legal tools available to anyone enduring, escaping, or surviving domestic violence. Hi, Theresa. How are you today?
I'm good, Beverly. Thank you for having me here.
I am so thrilled to have you. Can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself, what you do, and your expertise?
Sure. So, I am a family law attorney here in North Carolina. I practice out of Charlotte. I founded Modern Legal in 2020, actually, amidst the global pandemic. And I started the law firm with the hopes of not only adequately addressing our community's family law needs, but also to expand the different ways we approach family law, domestic violence, and other issues that affect our families. So, for example, we have a team of 4 attorneys that practice both in North and South Carolina, as well as a notable support staff that help our clients navigate the complexities of everything that comes with separation, divorce, child abuse, domestic violence, and other family law related issues. I've been practicing over 11 years, as you noted, but I have a team that has various experiences as well.
And that team is so absolutely critical, isn't it?
Yes, I agree.
That is so important. What would you guesstimate is the percentage of domestic abuse, child custody issues within your practice? Is it
Well,
significant?
so child custody is our primary area of practice. I would say on any given day, anywhere from 60 to 75% of our cases involve child custody issues. And the reason why is child custody really is the only cause of action that can be relitigated. So if you think
Hmm.
about it, if you're charged with a crime, if you're found guilty or not guilty, that's done. With child
Right.
custody, you could have a trial on a child custody arrangement today, but that child custody arrangement needs to be changed, say, in 3 years, 4 years, 6 years, because the needs of a child change as they get older.
Absolutely.
So we
Absolutely.
we stick with the family all the way through.
Um, so this is a question that's really important to me. How is the common definition of domestic violence different from the legal definition versus how you see the definition of domestic abuse?
Well, let me start with I understand that in North Carolina we have what we call the domestic violence order of protection. So, domestic violence for the order of protection specifically is relatively narrow. There must be an imminent threat of harm and/or actual assault, a physical injury, or a physical interaction. Again, that's imminent harm or a physical assault. That is just to get the domestic violence order of protection. Otherwise, at least in North Carolina, there is no definition of domestic violence. And what I like to tell my
really? Okay.
clients, yeah, that's only for the domestic violence order of protection. So if we think about it in a broader sense, you can bring in other issues about domestic violence, such as emotional, financial, and other forms of abuse.
So, in those forms, in the legal world, what's the difference in the evidence you would need to create and the strategy you would use as an attorney comparing physical abuse to all the other forms of abuse?
Well, it really depends on what cause of action you're pursuing. So, for example, you don't necessarily need to show physical abuse if you're looking for spousal support. And spousal support is to remedy the financial abuse of a situation, for example.
Okay. Does domestic abuse influence the amount of spousal support?
Not necessarily. It's just whether or not you're entitled to it. So
Gotcha.
there's what we call, at least in North Carolina,
Right.
what we call the burden to show dependency, as well as the entitlement to spousal support. So if you are the lower income earner, or say you're a stay-at-home spouse or parent, you can not only show that you have lower financial means to sustain yourself after the separation, but if you go one step further and show that there's been domestic violence, then you're more likely to at least get some amount and for a certain duration of spousal support.
Wow. And I noticed in some of my reading that I think 6 states now incorporate coercive control in their domestic violence laws. I think the most recent one to pass it was New Jersey. Is that something you're hoping for in North Carolina?
I get a little hesitant about legislative action, just because we want to try not to narrow the field so much so that people who are not able to meet a certain burden still get the protections they need. So, for example, at the end of the day, whether or not someone is experiencing only physical abuse, or they're experiencing the whole gambit, for example, physical, emotional, mental, financial. For example, a lot of unfortunately abusers utilize the children as a form of abuse. So that can be brought up in child custody actions already. And I wouldn't want any type of law in place to say, well, there has to be coercive control. What's the burden to meet that? Does that make sense?
Right. Could it be either or? Could it be either or?
Well, I would argue, because I like to think that domestic violence can include an array of behaviors. I think if someone says, I'm going to keep the children from you, or I'm going to take the children away, I think by definition that's coercive. But I wouldn't want the legislature to define coercive control and say, oh, well, there's a higher burden than that just existing.
Gotcha. Do you use a particular strategy, legal strategy, when you're approaching, let's say, domestic abuse within a divorce?
Oh, definitely. I like to tell my team that we need to handle domestic violence in domestic violence situations in a very different manner than, say, parties who are separating simply because they both agreed to separate and there is no sign of domestic violence. More specifically, I work with my team on what we call empowerment representation. And that is a means to help our clients who are surviving domestic violence situations and getting out of them to really find the tools to become empowered and sustain themselves in the next chapter. And I find that it's very important that the legal process be one of those tools. So, for example, I will help my client organize their financials, their pictures, their evidence, but I will give them a lot of tasks to accomplish themselves. And then I will lay out, here are the 3 different roads that we can go down with your legal strategy, option A, B, or C, and I'll leave my survivor to choose which road to go down. The reason why is because at the end of the day, a lot of survivors have been deprived of the option to even choose. A lot of them have not been able to make a decision on very basic things, such as, how much they get to pay for groceries, or how much they get to spend on gifts, or what they can even wear. And so if
Right.
I can help them get more control over their legal situation, which is, a very serious topic, then
Yes.
down the road, when they're talking about, okay, do I buy a house? Do I, sign my child up for this pediatrician or that pediatrician? They feel like they have the tools in place to make those decisions.
Gotcha. Um, One of the things I've encountered in my clients that have experienced some form of domestic abuse is that they seem to be beaten down
Yeah.
emotionally, and and are not at, let's say, the same level of clarity and strength that someone going through an amicable divorce or a divorce without abuse would go through. How do you help them in
Sure.
terms of, you said you give them work to do, they have things to do. How do you help them, given that they may be in a more depressed state or a more overwhelmed state and not quite so capable of preparing information?
Well, I think that starts with, well, what's the attorney's role? The
Right.
client is not necessarily preparing anything, right?
Okay.
It is my job to step in and prepare everything, whether it's a domestic violence situation or not, and gather the information and items needed to pursue their case. So it really is, for all of our cases, we are there to be an advocate and a counselor of law, to really guide our clients through understanding the different scenarios and different factors involved in their legal case. And that's regardless if domestic violence is involved. Now, specifically for domestic violence situations, we help empower them, give them options. But go one step further, yes, we have to be extremely patient. We have to be very cognizant of the fact that, for example, if we ask for bank statements, maybe the route of getting those bank statements is actually sitting next to our client, having them sign in next to us on a computer, and literally guide them in downloading them and transferring them to our client management system. That may be a little different than some of my other clients who are like, oh, yeah, I can download them myself. I'll email them to you.
Exactly. And I do a lot of that as well with my
Mhm.
coaching of that. So I know how critical that is. One of the issues that I hear victims talk about is the treatment they receive from their attorneys and from the court system. What is your advice to legal and court professionals as to how to handle, let's say, an abuse survivor differently than a non-abuse survivor going through divorce?
The very first step is to understand domestic violence. I have taught a
Okay.
number of continuing legal education courses to attorneys specifically, as well as just talk to other professionals that come into interaction with domestic violence survivors, whether that's a realtor or a financial advisor. And the very, very first piece of advice is inform yourself. For example, the power and control wheel. It is a basic tool that many domestic violence professionals utilize to help not only themselves identify if a case has domestic violence, but also to explain that to your client. I have had clients that sit across my table and I can identify that they are going through a domestic violence situation, but they themselves don't recognize it. Now, I'm not necessarily here to tell them until they're ready, right? But on the flip side, I also know that based on my ability to identify domestic violence factors and characteristics of a relationship, then I know how to approach that case differently than I say these other cases that don't involve domestic violence.
Wow. Abuse survivors need an attorney like you. It would change the face of their experience, I believe.
Mhm. I
So,
agree.
so true. Um, how do how do you approach, or how do you approach the situation where someone comes to you and it's clear to you, both from their behavior and potentially the history that they've shared with you, that they are an abuse victim, but they don't realize it.
That's where we have to be very, I call it the white glove treatment, where it's, I'm not here to make them self-identify as a domestic violence survivor. Rather, I am here to help them get the relief they are pursuing. So, for
Gotcha.
example, if they tell me that their significant other that they're separating from has threatened to take the children, then it's, let's identify, well, first off, can the abuser do that? Second off, what protections are in place legally speaking to protect against that? And that maybe let's go ahead and pursue legal action. So that could be filing a complaint for child custody, even pursuing emergency custody should that be applicable. But it really depends on that client's specific situation. And then further down the line, as we're going through the different factors of their case, they may come to realize themselves, I think I may be enduring domestic violence. Okay, well, then let's discuss that specifically. So that could be sitting down with them. I have myself pulled out that power and control wheel and said, well, let's go through this together, kind of like a worksheet.
Right.
Did you experience all of these factors? Then yes, you may be exhibiting, or your relationship has exhibited domestic violence tendencies. And because of that, here are other tools and resources that you can utilize.
When you're going through the legal process, do you experience much bias against domestic violence victims in terms of misconception about abuse victims?
Ooh, that's a hard question, because bias, legally speaking, is a little bit different than I think society would perceive. So when we talk about like a legal bias, we talk about certain presumptions that exist. For example, if someone wants to call their mom as a character witness in any case, family law or otherwise, I, as their attorney, would say, well, it's your mom. Do you have a good relationship with her? Of course. I love my mom. My mom's always been there for me, and I've always been there for her. Okay. Well, then of course, your mom is going to say great things about you because you're their child. You are probably the best child on the whole of planet Earth. That's what we consider legal bias. So I may not necessarily call a mother to the stand if they're going to testify about the character of my client, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Now, bias against domestic violence, I wouldn't say there is domestic violence or bias against domestic violence. I think our judicial system is well informed enough to try to be sensitive to domestic violence and its unique characteristics. Rather, I think it's more an issue of miseducation and misunderstanding of what domestic violence is. So, for example, domestic violence in the court system here in North Carolina, to obtain a domestic violence order of protection is very different than what you and I would call domestic violence, which is a much larger umbrella. So, for example, if a year ago your abuser threatened to take the children, but that never happened, then we can't bring that up to pursue a domestic violence order of protection. On the flip side, if they are right in this moment threatening to hurt you, take the children, and there may have been a physical altercation, then yes, because of the imminency more so, there is the right to pursue that domestic violence order of protection. And so what I think there is, how should I say, a misunderstanding is if a survivor pursues domestic violence order of protection and it's denied, then they think the judicial system doesn't understand domestic violence.
Right.
From my perspective, I think it's more so a situation of that survivor not understanding the law. And that's why it is so crucial to have an attorney or someone to guide them as a legal counselor through the process of that domestic violence order of protection. On the flip side, for example, let's say there's been financial abuse and there's been a dependent spouse that has not had access to the bank accounts or the money or the funds. Okay, well then on my side, I'm not pursuing a domestic violence order of protection for that problem. I'm pursuing what we call spousal support, whether that be post-separation support or alimony. And in domestic violence situations, I have been able to show to the judge that, Your Honor, because of the domestic violence situation, my domestic violence survivor, cannot work or has a limited means of being able to work. And then when the judge calculates the survivor and the abuser's incomes for spousal support purposes, then the judge may impute less income to my client, or maybe no income at all even. Mm-hmm. And that's then where we get that order to get funds from the abuser to the survivor.
Wow. We're going to take a break right now and come right back. Domestic abuse survivors experience a lack of trust in the divorce and legal systems in place to protect them, according to recent research. Many report re-traumatization in court and reported that legal professionals have verbally threatened them, mocked them, did not give them a chance to speak in court, exaggerated the survivor's faults, and provoked them to elicit emotional reactions. This can vary by state and by court. Some are more understanding, more educated about domestic abuse, and some are not. The Divorce Coalition is a nonprofit organization created to change this experience for abuse victims and survivors. For more information, go to www.divorcecoalition.com, and you can support us by making a tax-deductible donation at divorcecoalition.com/donate-now. And now back to the show. Theresa, you are such a fountain of information. There was one term you used that struck me, and that was post-separation. And I hear people talk about post-separation abuse. Can you talk to me a little bit about what your experience is with post-separation abuse and what can legal professionals do in the face of it?
Sure. That's a whole array of different forms of abuse. So first off, it's important for professionals involved in domestic violence to understand that when a survivor or victim is trying to leave and become a survivor, that is the most dangerous time for that survivor. So that could be in the form of they don't have money. That could be in the form of their life may be threatened either by the abuser or other third parties, such as the abuser's family, friends, etc. And that's also mentally and emotionally a very dangerous time, because I think a lot of people can relate stepping into, say, a new job or going to college or a new chapter in their life where they didn't know what the next step was, but generally they had a lot of support. Well, unfortunately, a lot of our survivors don't have as much support. I have been in plenty of hearings and proceedings where my survivor has no family because they don't necessarily think there was domestic violence or for whatever reason. Their friend group, because they shared it with the abuser, or may have not had friends outside of the abuser's friends.
Because they were isolated, right? Yeah.
Exactly, because they were isolated. So I have a lot of domestic violence survivors who have no support. And just think, if you took any one of those life-changing steps in your life and you didn't have any support, how scary that would be.
Absolutely.
What would you use as coping mechanisms? I have clients where every once in a while I'll be like, okay, you have stress in your body. We need to get it out. Maybe go for a walk, or let me talk to my local boxing gym and get you a boxing class, right?
Right.
We need to get it out. And so in the post-separation time period, where they've overcome that hurdle of getting out of a domestic violence situation, it then is figuring out what tools we can utilize to not only further empower them, but also address any type of post-separation abuse, which can come in the form of harassment. There are certain tools that we can put in place. This could mean that, hey, we block the phone number. If it's appropriate to do so, block the phone number of the abuser. It could be that you can only correspond through email, or go one step further, you can only correspond through attorneys. I've had that happen. There's also the use of the litigation process itself, if litigation is occurring, to paper the survivor's side, what we call it, to death, paper to death. And it could be drawing out proceedings. And there comes a point where a divorce professional, specifically a family law attorney, needs to know when to, yes, let's try to negotiate, or when it's like, you know what, there's no reason to continue negotiations. Let's just take this to court. Especially because an abuser, especially if they have all the financial resources, can utilize those financial resources to frustrate the litigation process.
I would think that physical abuse, financial abuse, child abuse, maybe sexual abuse are the easiest, and easy is a very stretch of the imagination, types of abuse to prove in court versus the emotional, mental, those kinds of things. What's your opinion on all of that?
This is going to sound a little curt, and I don't mean it to sound that way. A lot of the stuff we don't have to prove at all.
Okay.
To be honest, it's not necessarily relevant to the divorce itself.
Gotcha.
For example, if someone has experienced physical or sexual abuse, that may have to do with the criminal action, but not the family law action.
Gotcha. And in some states, just for clarity, they organize it differently, right? That there's, like in North Carolina, there's a family court and a criminal court, but in some states, some of the functions are all organized differently, right?
I'm not sure. I only practice in North Carolina, but that's possible.
Okay. Okay. How important would you say to a legal case is documentation from the victim, documenting things that have happened?
Yeah, again, it's the end goal. So, for example, if you're pursuing primary custody of your children, it's documenting everything as it relates to your children.
Okay.
If your end goal is to get financial support or get certain items of property, then we need all the documents. So that could be investment account statements, bank statements. That could be, creating a budget for your spending habits. That could be a whole host of different documents for sure.
Gotcha. You had also mentioned a minute ago about abuse by paper in the legal proceedings. I have a client whose spouse serves her with motions every Friday afternoon at 4 p.m. when her attorney is no longer available. And these motions are frightening to her because she doesn't understand them. She thinks that there is a lot of weight behind them. Have you ever seen that? And how can you deal with this motion after motion and paper kind of abuse?
I schedule them on for hearing. Even if they're not my motion, I push for those motions to be heard. I think to someone going through that, I would say first and foremost, maybe tell your attorney, hey, you can hold this till Monday. Just because, let's say we're served with something at 4 o'clock on a Friday, it does not need to be responded to immediately. Nothing needs to be responded to immediately. Even I would say, I would go so far as to say the only thing would be an emergency custody action. But even those, the judge is given multiple days to respond to. So you can at least take the weekend. And I've had clients do that where they say, can you call me, schedule a time to talk with me before you give me a motion, if a motion such as that comes up. That goes to the empowerment representation side. I will say, as attorneys, we are required to disclose everything that we get to our clients. Why? Because we are not the driver. Our clients are the driver of their case. We just help them with their case and help them figure out where to direct their case. But there are different strategies you can utilize with your client, especially if they're in a domestic violence situation, to lower the impact or the blow when a client does receive a motion. Generally, what I do is we'll send a motion, and I'll say in the same email, please find attached, Theresa would like to speak to you. Here is her availability. So our clients know immediately that they are going to talk with me as soon as possible after receiving that motion.
Gotcha. What can an attorney do who has not dealt with divorce cases with domestic violence, both out of court and in court, who wants more information to be able to produce a better case? What
Sure.
information, what sources are there available for them?
First and foremost, if they're an attorney, they are already required to take continuing legal education courses as required by the state bar. And so very first step is find those CLEs that are focused on domestic violence situations. Then also in your community, seek out those divorce professionals, not only attorneys, but any divorce professional that has experience with domestic violence cases. That could be a therapist, that could be a divorce coach, that could be other attorneys. And sit down with them, have a coffee, have lunch, and talk about how do we handle domestic violence situations. I love spreading the word about the Power and Control Wheel or other resources that are available on domestic violence, because it is an arena that not everyone gets, but once you get it, you get it. And it's like,
Gotcha.
I can help those survivors once I get how it all is, how it all plays, both for the survivor and their journey to overcome the abuse, as well as to create a strong legal case for all of their needs.
Theresa is also going to help us create education in the Divorce Coalition for attorneys and other divorce professionals on domestic abuse in divorce. But I also love the idea of education toward your empowerment representation. That to me addresses so much of the domestic abuse victims' concerns. That's a wonderful approach that I wish more and more legal and court professionals could think about.
Sure.
Just give you huge kudos.
Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, you're great. What family laws assist domestic violence victims and survivors?
Sure. So we have what we call Chapter 50 here in North Carolina. It's the main family law statute. Now, I will point out, it's not a different statute for domestic violence survivors versus non-domestic violence survivors, but rather it's in that statute that we have laws pertaining to spousal support, laws pertaining to property distribution, laws pertaining to child custody and child support. So it really is that main statute that family law attorneys work from. And those laws, depending on the attorney, can be creatively utilized to help that domestic violence survivor specifically for their needs.
To jump back, I just thought of a question about what you said right before this, and that was seeking out other professionals in your community. How does somebody find professionals with domestic abuse expertise?
That's tricky, because I will say a lot of individuals who say that they work with domestic violence survivors may be doing that just for marketing efforts, which is not necessarily a bad thing. On the flip side, it's also understanding that not everyone has the same level of expertise or same level of experience with domestic violence survivors. So it's really important, and this may be hard for survivors, but it's really important to talk to different attorneys, different coaches, different therapists, and they themselves, if they have been in the field for a while, they will know other domestic violence professionals that can help them. So for example, in my firm, in my team, we literally have what we call the Modern Legal Network, and it is our private referral network that we send clients to depending on their needs, domestic violence or otherwise. And based on their needs, after we go through them, we figure out who to connect them with. So for example, if I have a client who is a domestic violence survivor, was a female abused by a male and is very hesitant in the presence of males, then I will refer them for financial advising to only female financial advisors.
Gotcha.
But further, all the female financial advisors on my list, I or someone on my team has personally met with, whether that be by coffee or over lunch or in a networking group, but we have personally vetted them to make sure that they are able to address our clients' needs.
Wow. How important is that? And then the question that so many people ask is, what resources are available for a victim survivor if they don't have enough money for a private attorney?
And that gets tricky. So in family law specifically, um, you don't have the right to an attorney. So
Oh,
because of that, yeah, in North Carolina, and because of that, there may be a lot of things you have to handle on your own. So in Mecklenburg County, we do have the self-help center, which is a self-help office literally at the Mecklenburg County Courthouse where someone can go and read up on these different causes of action. I would say the most commonly utilized cause of action notebook in their room is probably the child custody
okay.
notebook, because they do have forms that someone can fill out to file a complaint for custody, and to pursue that form of relief. And so there
So
are legal aid resources.
that would be them pursuing the divorce themselves. Is that right?
Depends. So the divorce is separate from the child custody action.
Okay.
I will note specifically in North Carolina, we don't even talk about divorce until a year after the separation date.
Gotcha.
So rather, it's again focusing on what does our client need? Do they need financial support? Do they need part of the retirement account? Do they need the house? Do they need um, custody of their children? And so those different causes of actions, there are resources for in that self-help center. They can also pursue assistance from Legal Aid of North Carolina,
Hmm.
as well as some local, throughout North Carolina, there are local resources and nonprofits that can help them.
Hmm.
So, for example, we have the Charlotte Legal Advocacy Center. Um, but those resources, I will say, have limited means. They are nonprofits. So, for example, let's say you have a child support case going through what we call the Title IV or IV courts. There are probably, oh goodness, hundreds of cases scheduled a day. And so they cycle through those cases pretty quickly. And if you really want the judge to hear more about your specific situation and bring light to everything that you did endure that has an impact on whether or not, say, income is imputed to you for child support or spousal support purposes, or whether it's a factor in possibly getting greater than 50% of the marital estate and equitable distribution, then it really is figuring out either on your own or possibly with the assistance of an attorney in the background in pursuing your relief.
Wow.
I wish there were more financial resources dedicated to domestic violence survivors to hire private attorneys, because I mean a lot of the stories I hear are the fact that they didn't get the help at the beginning, which then
Right.
creates so many problems down the road.
Right. Absolutely. I
Yeah.
think one of the things I stress the most um, when someone is contemplating divorce and is living with an abuser is a safety plan and to talk to an attorney right away. Normally, in non domestic abuse cases, as a divorce coach, I recommend they start with a divorce coach. But in domestic abuse situations, I recommend they go straight to a divorce attorney, and whatever they do, do not physically leave until they have a safety plan. Statistics I've seen are upwards of 70% of women that leave their abusers are murdered when they don't have such a plan. So that is so critical to me. And it sounds like that's very critical to you as well.
It is. It is. Creating that game plan is key. And figuring out what tools are available even before you separate or leave, if you're able to sustain staying for a little while longer.
Yeah. And unfortunately, those that have a higher income don't have an issue with what their plan is. They have resources for where to go, places to stay, money to spend. But those that don't have those resources are kind of at a disadvantage.
They can be. I mean, there are a lot of resources, especially because there are a lot of domestic violence nonprofits and shelters throughout at least the state of North Carolina. And mean, you can kind of trace the history of the legislation all the way up to the U.S. Congress on that. But I think it's not being afraid to, one, ask for help, and then two, to be humble enough that you're going to have to make certain sacrifices. And that could mean you're staying at the night at a shelter, even if you've never stayed at a shelter before.
Exactly. Theresa, this has been so fascinating. How can our listeners find you?
Sure. So I would direct all of our listeners to head to our website, www.modernlegalnc.com. We also have a growing social media presence. So we have a Facebook page, an Instagram page, a LinkedIn page, and a YouTube page. Feel free to follow us. We have a lot of information released on a regular basis. This includes videos, articles. It also includes our podcast that was recently released called Legal Lounge. So head on over to our at Modern Legal YouTube page, and you can find some videos and podcasts about these crucial topics that affect our domestic violence, as well as in general, our divorce populations.
Wonderful. So, to my audience, thank you for being a guest with myself and Theresa on Divorce Coalition Live. If you'd like to listen to this episode again, check it out at herempowereddivorce.com under the live show tab or at WGSN's YouTube page. All of Theresa's information will be available in the show notes. Please like and subscribe our episodes so we can receive and help as many people as possible. You can find the Divorce Coalition at divorcecoalition.com, and please share our Instagram page at Divorce Coalition page on Instagram and on Facebook. Join us in the fight to change a survivor's divorce journey. Stay tuned next Tuesday at 9 a.m. Eastern Time for another episode of Divorce Coalition.live. And starting in March, we will be moving to a new day and time, Thursdays at 10 a.m. Eastern, and going to a weekly show rather than an every other week. Until next time, remember, knowledge is power, stay safe, and grow.